So next time you look at Gothic facade, you'll understand a bit more about what it would have meant to its medieval audience. And you know what? It will still look beautiful.
So neat. We have, of course, a cathedral or two here. Lady of Guadalupe is one where they do a lot of concerts. And they have the one St. Andrews, St. Andrews out in Eagle River, the biggest one in Alaska, actually. But they don't do all the carvings and everything as you see in this. This is the Gothic period. So, moving along from Augustine, I wanted to go on to Boethius. Just don't have any readings from him, but you can actually look at his guide to the complex, or actually the that's some one that we'll get later, actually, from Moses Maimonides. What was his book? The Consolation. His is the Consolation of Philosophy, and it's kind of interesting because Boethius is also considered by some, and it's kind of confusing why. It's called the last Roman. Why on earth would he be called the last Roman? But I think they're wrong. It just doesn't make sense, actually. But he's often called that because he's killed by his emperor. And the conflict between him and his emperor is that he is a follower of Athanasius, which was the Orthodox. Remember, the Council of Nicaea had an argument who should, we follow, and it was Athanasius, and the Arius doctrine was considered to be heresy and condemned. But remember, I mentioned that didn't actually do away with it. You're still going to be loaded with it throughout. In fact, we still have the conflict today. But in any case, his emperor Theodosius, I think it was, Theodosius, literally God's docent, I suppose, is a follower of Arius, and he didn't trust Boethius. So even though Boethius was really an important counselor for him and very important, he was imprisoned, and for about a year he was in the prison and even tortured. And he writes a book called The Consolation of Philosophy to basically explain how just at least thinking about philosophy somehow helps him out while he's in prison. But prior to his being arrested for possible conflict with the emperor, he was trying to translate all of Aristotle's works into Latin. And he did succeed in translating a lot of the Organon, the books that are considered the tool where we get the logic from. And it's considered thanks to that work that the logic was saved for the West instead of lost, because they no longer had a Greek translator anymore. And they didn't have the text available, I suppose. Theodoric, the Austric, was the one that killed him. There's the Consolation of Philosophy. You can have a look at that if you're interested. So I just wanted to mention him, but then I wanted to go on to the main individual to look at today, and that is Anselm. Anselmo. He's originally from Ostia, however you say that, Alsta. In any case, he's known as Anselm of Canterbury because even though most of his life he spent in France and as a monk, was even the abbot of the biggest of the monasteries in France, where he did all of his writing. He was sent by the Pope to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, where he basically ended up having to argue with King William the Conqueror over his treatment of the Saxons, because the church wanted to make sure that the Norman knights knew that the Saxons were considered members of the church and Christians, and so should be treated as well as the Normans would treat themselves. But of course that was a conflict. You're familiar with any of the stories like Sir Ivanhoe and all those interesting books. But so Anselm ended up frequently going back and forth to Rome, and I think he was very willing to do that, because I don't think he really enjoyed living in England. So when William told him, go check with the Pope on that, he said, okay. He would literally spend months, of course, traveling across France where he wanted to be, all the way to the Pope and checking. William wants to do this. Is that all right? No. Okay. Oh, then he goes back. So it's quite interesting. He ends up giving William last rites on his deathbed, and so on. But it's, by the way, considered to be an ongoing problem. The British monarch didn't really like being told what to do by the Pope, and so there was quite a few conflicts between the two of them, until eventually Henry VIII broke away completely from the church on the grounds that he needed a divorce, and the Pope wasn't able to give it because he was surrounded by the father's forces of the Queen. So you have trouble doing theological things like that when you're in that situation. But what makes Anselm most famous is the most famous argument there is, and that's referred to today as the ontological argument. And you can find that in his Proslogium, but we'll just go right to ontological. And ontological basically means, from the definition, ontos is Greek for the definition, and logical, of course, logical. And so it's from the definition. And ontology is basically the study of being itself. You know, what exists, basically, right? And can you know what exists based on the concept of the thing? So we end up with the ontological argument. And let me go over. I don't want that one. That one's too complex. Let's try this one. So, who gives us the first proof for the existence of God? It's not really a proof, but of course Plato starts off. He's the one that gives us theologia, the concept. And what Plato considers is that there is the good creates everything, so obviously the good must exist, even though he doesn't think of it as a material thing. He thinks of it as an abstraction. Remember, the sun is just a metaphor for it. Doesn't really think of the sun. It's not like Akhenaten, where the sun seems to be the god of everything, but instead we get this abstract concept of the good. Aristotle comes up with a little bit more of a concrete proof, if you think of it that way, because he's absolutely more of a materialist, right? Nothing exists unless it has substance. But he does, in defining the four different kinds of causes of everything, the material cause, the ideal cause, or the form of the thing, right? the efficient cause, which is the initiator of the changes that take place from one thing to another, and the telos, or the purpose of everything. And so for Aristotle, the efficient cause of everything has to be the prime mover, the first mover. The prime mover is not moved by something else, but instead is what moves everything. And kind of an astronomical sense for Aristotle, it seems like the prime mover is whatever it is that's bigger than the cosmos and pushes it so that you get this movement, which is obvious when you look at the stars. You go out early in the evening and you see the stars over here, and you come out later and you see the stars have shifted, right? It's pretty obvious that they move. And so something must move them, right? And as far as Aristotle is concerned, that's the prime mover is moving those. And it's the unmoved mover. It's not being moved itself. And you think, well, how do we know this? Well, it does have an interesting argument that I think is quite interesting, and that's why I said it's interesting. But if you think of time as moving in this direction, right? And it doesn't matter which direction. It depends on your culture. Some people think it goes that way. Time forward, whatever. But say time goes this way, right? And you've got periods or time on the way, right? There has to be a beginning point of the argument, right? That this is the beginning. Because if there wasn't a beginning there, instead, time would go in that direction as well. This is Aristotle, right? So if you didn't have a beginning, time would be actually going in the opposite direction as well as in this direction. And in that case, we could never have gotten here. And that gets into Zeno's paradox, because from the starting point of the arrow, to get from point A to B, first you have to go half the distance, then half that distance, and you actually can never get there, right? And so for Aristotle, if you're not going to have a starting point, you can't actually have gotten here, and obviously we are, so there must have been a beginning. And if you watched the Lagoon, Aristotle's Lagoon, the interesting argument is that from an evolutionary standpoint, doesn't think there is such a thing for Aristotle. Instead, he thinks everything was created pretty much as it is, with the relationships that are all there, and it just repeats. It just continues in kind of a circle. And yet, time-wise, Aristotle gives us the prime mover. And is that God? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know for sure that Aristotle really calls it God. However, after Aristotle, then you end up with all of the different arguments that follow from that. What we'll see when we get to Thomas Aquinas is we get, and actually I'll use Kant. Kant gives us 4 categories of arguments for the existence of God. The first one is the cosmological, and that's what we're seeing with Aristotle, talking about there has to be a first cause. So we look around, we see things happening. Everything that happens happened because of the prior cause. The prior cause leads to a prior cause, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't go on ad infinitum, or you wouldn't have a now. And so there must be a first cause of everything, and that's God, as far as Aquinas is concerned. And Kant critiques that, but because things are happening now doesn't prove that there is something before it, etc. So Kant critiques it basically the way we might as a skeptic today. But nonetheless, for Aquinas, there's a cosmos, and the cosmos has a design, something created it. The second kind of argument is the ontological argument, and that's the argument that we're going to look at with Anselm. That's based on the definition of God, right? The third kind of argument is the telos, or the teleological argument, and that's the argument that there has to be a designer. Look how everything is so perfectly created and designed. There must have been an intelligence that did that, and so therefore there must be a God. And Kant, who critiques all three of those kinds of arguments, then turns around and says, but there is morality, and morality wouldn't make any sense whatsoever unless there was a God. And so therefore God exists, says Kant, right? Well, my favorite of all these arguments is the ontological argument, because I think it actually works. The problem most people have with it, and I'll present it this is pretty much the way Anselm presents it, right? The definition that he gives to God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. He's not defining God as a particular thing, but instead by saying that nothing greater can be conceived. So he's not trapped by saying God sits on a throne in space. I saw actually a picture in an Enquirer, that newspaper that you usually would see like on sale at cars, you know. So as you're going out and you're paying, and you're waiting, you see these interesting little newspapers, and the one had a picture of heaven, and it said that the new telescope had found heaven, and it looked just like the Acropolis in Athens, except it was kind of outlined in stars. This is clearly Photoshop, you know, etc. It was so hilarious, I almost bought the paper just to have it, but I thought, I can make it myself. You know, there's no need to buy it.